Three. Hello everybody. In today's video we're going to take a look at some of the tools found here, pose tools, for creating joints and posing your meshes, your models in Mudbox. So the first tool that we'll take a look at is the Create Joint tool, which will allow us to create a joint or a hierarchy of joints for our mesh here. So as you can see, I've got the T-Rex mesh here. One thing I would like you to take note of is that I have the Create Joint tool set currently to one joint at a time. As you can see, one joint at a time is checked right now, meaning that I can only create one joint at a time. Now, for this particular example, I think I will switch over to my side view so that we get a perfect profile of this T-Rex. And I'm going to take my mouse and left mouse button, and I'm simply going to click right about where you can see where my mouse is. That would be a good place maybe to have a joint for the base of the tail. And I'll simply draw out along, in this case, the length of the tail in this direction. We'll just pull this out like this. Notice this green line here, that indicates the weighting, just so that you understand, that's the weighting. In other words, the arrow, the way it's pointed, that's the direction of the joint. And then when I release, you can see that we have this gradation happening of green indicating the influence that this joint will have on our mesh. So you can think of this as a fall off, and the areas on our mesh that are more intense green will be influenced more strongly by this joint. And as it becomes less intense of a green, it'll be less and less influenced by the joint here. The next tool that we'll take a look at is the Pose tool found here. And with that tool activated, we can now move this joint. Notice that actually I get this pop-up here when I select where it indicates that the left button, you can use the left button to rotate vertically and horizontally. And the middle mouse button to scale. So let's go ahead and try the left mouse button so that we can rotate this tail. In the side view, you'll notice that if I rotate, you can see that the axis that it's rotating the tail in, if I go left to right, if I go up and down, you can see how it's rotating it in this other axis. So we can rotate it basically in two axes, but it's dependent on your camera view, unlike how you might be working with rotating joints in other 3D packages. In Mudbox, you're rotating it according to your camera view. I'm going to switch over to my perspective view so that we can see this a little bit better. So more or less we're at a side view, and as you can see, if I go left right, the tail goes in this axis, and if I go up down, it's going in this axis here. So the question is, how do I effectively work with posing the tail then? Well, from my personal experience, I find that it is most effective to rotate the scale by moving my camera around. So for instance, if I wanted the tail to come down onto, let's say, the ground plane, I might, for instance, go more up to a top view and rotate it down that way. Now, if I wanted to continue posing other parts of this T-Rex here, let's say I want to bring the tail a little bit back like that, but then I want to start bending it along the length of the tail, what I can do is, of course, create more joints. So I'll select my Create Joints tool, and maybe we'll place another joint, about here. Once again, I'll point down the tail. And notice that now we have a joint here, which we can switch over to our Pose tool, and we can continue posing this tail to get maybe more of a nice rounded curve happening here. If I wanted to continue posing this character, again, I could just continue creating new joints. What you'll notice, though, is that because we set it to one joint at a time, we truly are only working with one joint at a time. We're not really creating a hierarchy here. I'm going to create a joint in this direction here, and we can play around a little bit with its posing. Maybe another one for the head and neck area. And you get the idea. Now, while this approach of doing one joint at a time might not seem as robust as in other packages, it actually isn't such a bad way to pose your character in the context of working in Mudbox. I wouldn't want to animate this way, but as a modeling slash posing approach, it's really not that bad to work with creating one joint at a time. Now let's say I want to maybe adjust the pose on the right leg. I want to make it a little less symmetrical from the left and the right leg to add maybe a little bit more interest to this pose. Let's see what we can do. So I've got my Create Joint tool selected, and I'm going to draw a joint chain down this way. Now, I got to be very careful. Notice how the line is drawing, and that's going to indicate, for instance, if I drop it here, that's going to indicate that it's going to be influencing the tail as well as, in this case, both legs. So you do really have to be very careful with this. Let's see what we can get here. That will result in a minimum amount of work. I'm going to draw the joint right about here. And that did a pretty good job. Let's see what we can do as far as posing it now. And perhaps that's pretty good. If you're pretty strategic about how you place your joints, you can eliminate a lot of the work of needing to work on the weights. If you're familiar with creating skeletons and binding them to meshes in other software, you know that oftentimes that can involve a fair amount of work. The assigning vertices to specific joints. But let's take a look at this human character here. And I'm going to put a joint into the right arm so that I can pose it. And I'll draw it down like this. And you'll notice that if I draw it down the length of the arm here, and I release, then I end up getting a lot of the weight happening on the figure itself. And in fact, if I come in here and pose the arm, you'll notice that it affects the body as well. So if I'm working with one joint at a time, like with this example, what I would do if placing a joint in the arm is, rather than pointing it down the arm like that, I might place it like this and then point the joint out more in this direction, something like that. And that should give us a little bit better of a result if we need to pose this arm. Actually, notice, however, that we're still getting some weighting issues here on the body. So this is really a good opportunity to demonstrate this other tool here, which is the weights. And by selecting that, what we can do is paint influence as well as take away influence on our mesh. I'm going to make my brush a little smaller. And just to demonstrate how this works, I'm going to paint a little bit of the shoulder here. You can see that it's becoming green, indicating that it'll be influenced by this joint, meaning that if we were to pose this joint now, it's also going to be affecting the weights on that area. So that is how you make a joint affect a larger part of the mesh. However, we can also, of course, either invert the function by clicking on this checkbox here, like that, and then paint away the influence that we don't want. Or we can also hold down the control key, and that will do the same thing. That will allow us to paint away influence like this. Okay, let's see if we've improved the deformation on this mesh by going to our pose tool and moving the arm. As you can see, I'm still influencing some areas that I actually don't want. I think it's actually easier to go ahead and just check the invert function so that you're not constantly holding down the control button with this operation, unless you're needing to constantly switch from one to another, one action from another, either adding weights or taking away. And that's better. You can see actually I'm still ending up with some problem areas in the head and in the back, and a little bit of an influence still on the left arm as well. But hopefully you get the idea. Now let's return to the create joint. But this time we will uncheck one joint at a time, which will allow us to create a chain of joints in our mesh here. So I've got the lizard mesh here, and we'll go ahead and create some joints. Once again, I'm going to work with the tail, starting at the base of the tail. Draw out like this perhaps. Draw another joint. Third joint. And we'll create a fourth joint as well. So now we have a chain of joints, which you can see in our object list here. In fact, not a very effective joint chain, because you'll see that joint 2 is in fact not a child of joint 1, so that's a little bit frustrating. I'm not sure why that happened. So I'm not really sure why it drew the chain as it did. As you can see, I've got this joint 4, which is a child of 3, which is a child of 2. As I created this, I thought that joint 2 would be a child of joint 1, but it turned out not to be the case. But in any case, this actually is a good illustration of why I think that if you can get away with just creating one joint at a time for creating these kind of posing solutions, you might be better off doing it that way, rather than relying on creating a more complicated hierarchy. One thing that I don't recommend is trying to create a very complicated skeleton for a form like what we're looking at right now. But as you can see, I can take these individual joints on here and we can pose them. So as long as it's a joint chain that I think is fairly simple, you might have some luck with creating these hierarchies. In other words, in other cases, again, remember that you might want to just stick with creating one joint at a time. So back to the T-Rex. Let's take a look at this example one more time. I have my create joint selected. I currently have the setting to one joint at a time because I personally find that a little bit easier to work with than creating joint chains in Mudbox. I'm going to create a joint here, once again at the tail, and I'll simply draw out along the length of it, and I'll choose the pose tool so that I can start posing it. Remember that you can use your left mouse button to pose it, and it'll work in two different axes, in the vertical and the horizontal. So in this case, I can move it very easily in this axis or in this axis. However, the other thing I want to point out is that you can also, if it's dependent on whether you have your cursor on the joint or not. So if I have my cursor on the joint, I can rotate it in this axis very easily or in this axis. If I select the joint and I have my mouse off of it, then I can move it very easily in this axis as well. So you don't need to actually adjust your camera angle to work with these necessarily. You can also pose it that way and get it in all three axes if you wish. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that if you use your middle mouse button, you can scale it. Like that. And perhaps I'll just continue working on this T-Rex a little bit more and see what I can do with it. And as you can see, after a little work, I can start to make my T-Rex maybe start to look a little bit more dog-like. One other thing I should mention before wrapping up this video is that just like your sculpt tools, when you work with these pose tools, it's a good idea to work in layers. Now, I did not actually do that in my previous examples, but I'm going to go ahead and create a layer now and start working with these posing tools here in this scene. Perhaps my T-Rex starts to look a little bit more like a kangaroo now. But what you'll notice is if we go over to our sculpt layer and we deactivate that layer, it will go back to its original pose. So this is a very valuable thing. It's very valuable to work with layers when working with these pose tools because you'll get a lot more out of it by working that way. So in summary, while the posing tools in Mudbox are not incredibly robust, they're still a valuable tool set to know how to use when working in Mudbox software. I hope that this video has been useful for you, and thank you for watching.